Coming up, from the latest somewhat ridiculous rumor of a trade for the Brooklyn Nets to the available players on the free agent market, we break down from Karl Anthony-Towns to Christian Wood and Dario Saric, all of the options for the Brooklyn Nets to improve at the center position. Coming up next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends. It is the Locked On Nets podcast right here at Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I am Adam Armbrecht, breaking down the New York Football Giants on the One Giant podcast and having a heck of an off season over on the Devils Puck Luck podcast, breaking down your New Jersey Devils with Danny McDonough. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day. We're free on all those great platforms. And let you know today's episode is brought to you by Prize Pick. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code LOCKEDON. That's prizepicks.com, promo code LOCKEDON. And my friends, had so much fun doing a live episode yesterday morning. I decided to do it again, even if I didn't alert you over on social. But we're here. And we're going to be breaking down the center position. As we said, we know free agency is about to kick off here at the end of the week. There's already been some rumblings. There's already kind of some predictive moves that are going to be coming here around the league, including the extension of the bring back for Naz Reid with the Minnesota Timberwolves, which can be informative around Nicolas Claxton next offseason as well. So we'll talk a little bit about the immediate and about the long-term future. But at the highest level, we have to start with Karl Anthony-Towns. Now, this is the kind of thing that gets picked up in a little bit of a rumor cycle. Starts with some conversations on The Athletic. Then it matriculates into Bleacher Report. And then it siphons its way down until it gets to a place where essentially, following the extension, 3-year, $42 million for Naz Reid, which we'll discuss as it relates to Nicolas Claxton, you start to get these little rumblings that maybe the Minnesota Timberwolves are going to be in the market to try to move off of Karl Anthony-Towns. And in doing so, you're going to need to find a trade partner that has some type of sizable contract to make this money kind of line up. And naturally, the Brooklyn Nets and Ben Simmons come into the fray. Let's go ahead and make this clear up front. The Brooklyn Nets are not, this trade is not happening because on its surface, I'll tell you exactly why. Karl Anthony-Towns is about to have a $256 million contract kick in. And if you think that there's a reason beyond having obviously traded for Rudy Gobert and having Karl Anthony-Towns and then bringing back a player like Naz Reid and having $90 million occupied within one position on your roster, and that potentially being a problem for you. The idea here is that when this money kicks in and it goes 36, 50, 54, 58, and $62 million out to 27, 28, this is what the Timberwolves want to get off of, the long money. The Brooklyn Nets, while they may have their concerns around Ben Simmons, this tentative approach to saying, hey, if he can be healthy, he obviously has value, may not be $40 million worth of value, but there can be value there. They also know that they're much closer to the end of that contract journey than the beginning of it. Now, does that maybe under these new CBA terms start to open up the possibility of the Nets being maybe able to explore moving off of Ben Simmons if the right deal comes, if the right player is available? That's possible. And it's probably a conversation for another day. But the bottom line is, for everything that Karl Anthony-Towns is, which I like him as a player, heard him recently say that he's going to go down as someone who changed the position. Go see Nick Angstad from Locked On Mavs for his response to that. He happens to know a man that played that position in Dallas who is regarded as someone who changed the position in the NBA. He's a fantastic player. He does a lot of things that complement the Brooklyn Nets, but it just doesn't make sense for Brooklyn to get committed into that type of money. Again, it's not even about the individual. It's not about the necessarily even that contract. The Nets are still in this holding pattern to me around what they're going to do over these next couple of years. So that's how we dismiss that. But we do add in the footnote here that when we think about Nicolas Claxton and the Nas Reed signing, 3 years, $42 million, that can give us a little bit of a footprint into next off season and what Nicolas Claxton is maybe going to command or what the Nets will be looking to sign him to. By the way, I don't know how fans looked at that Nas Reed number and then related it back to Nicolas Claxton. What's wrong with that? What is wrong with what ends up being, what is that, 14 average AAV on a contract like that? I have no gripes with having Nicolas Claxton in and around that number, and it's probably going to be a little bit higher because, oh, by the way, I think that the Nets are going to expand his game continually going into this upcoming season. I'll be very interested to see how he looks now going into a full season after a full off season with Mikal Bridges, with, we think, Cameron Johnson, with Spencer Dinwiddie, right? And the players, Dorian Finney-Smith, Royce O'Neal, at least at this moment, going in with these players and seeing how his role continues to expand. Now, can you sit here and dream on, if we're just continuing to cap off this Karl Anthony-Towns conversation, about why it doesn't work in Minnesota and why, by the way, the big reason why Minnesota is also looking at it like this is we gave up everything to get Rudy Gobert. So we can't move off of Rudy. Like, we can't make that pivot here. We need to be able to go in another direction potentially. And by the way, inside of all of these articles, because speculation runs rampant, all that was communicated is that after this season, it would become difficult for the Minnesota Timberwolves to justify the money they'd be paying to those three players at that one single position. But going into this year, they can get away with it. Whether or not it's the best on-court product and yields the best results, that's a whole different discussion. That being the case, though, I like, one, not entertaining deals like this, though understanding why it's intriguing. It's another example of a big name, a superstar name, that I just don't think the Nets are really in the waters of. We did it with Damian Lillard. We kind of brushed aside DeJounte Murray thoughts. We've brushed aside a lot of different versions of this. And who knows, something may come up in the offseason. But so far, it seems like it's mostly been fluff. And I also like the footprints of a contract for Nicolas Claxton going forward. Coming up here in a second, though, we're going to turn our attention over to the market. We'll talk in-house first. Everything we're going to do about free agency and preparing for free agency, position by position. What do we have on the roster? Who are guys we want to keep? Who are guys we want to see us move away from? And then what are our options to replace and improve this team? So we're doing this for the center position. We'll probably lump together the backcourt into one conversation. Maybe we'll lump the forwards into another. This is already Thursday's episode. Friday is the start of free agency. So we'll probably push this out as quickly as we can and as detailed as we can. So coming up in a second, we talk about the options on the market for the Brooklyn Nets and the spectrum from the highest possible profile players available in free agency all the way down to veteran minimum guys that you may not get excited about when you hear the names, but can still be a marginal move in the right direction for the Brooklyn Nets. Before we get into that, though, I got to tell you about something else. And that's going to be our friends over at, oh, you guessed it, Prize Picks. Because Prize Picks is what makes daily fantasy made easy. You go ahead and you head over to prizepicks.com. You know that when you do not want to be looking to, excuse me, got a little caught up. I'm still ruminating, if I'm being honest, on the whole idea of Karl Anthony-Towns and why these things bubble up. But when you get over to Prize Picks, it's just you picking 2 to 6 players, and you'll go whether or not they'll hit the over or under on their Prize Picks projections. You can win up to 25 times your money on an entry. There's no competing against other people. It's just you versus the projections available, and Prize Picks offers projections on any sport that you can watch, including obviously the NBA, the NFL, MLB, NHL, PGA, college football, men's college basketball, women's college basketball, soccer, WNBA, esports, NASCAR, tennis, MMA, boxing, disc golf, Euro basketball, cricket, and more. So you're going to want to go ahead and download the Prize Picks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up for a opportunity to play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code all caps locked on. If you deposit 100, you get 100. You deposit 50, you get 50. You do all the versions of that. And all you know is that you can get up to 100% deposit match on $100. Don't forget to enter promo code Locked On at prizepicks.com or on the Prize Picks app. Woo! Made it through the journey. All right. Let's start talking about options that are on the table. I went ahead over at The Athletic. It's a good publication. John Hollinger breaking down the different tiers of players at the center position on the market. Now, before we talk about the guys that I think are options for the Brooklyn Nets, there are certainly some other names that are going to get mentioned here that you may want me to mention here. I tried to categorize this realistically by what we're hearing and what the intentions are of teams around the league. We already know that Kristaps Porzingis, that's the opt-in, move on, he's gone to Boston. Okay, fine. But even when you get to a guy like Jakob Poeltl and you think about Toronto, this is giving us both what the board, BORD, money sign, evaluation is for this player, as well as Hollinger looking at whether or not he agrees with the evaluation and what the potential outcome is going to be here this offseason. Toronto is pot committed on a player that right now is getting an evaluation around $25 million per year. Whether or not that number could be a little bit high, they made the move for him. He is maybe moving into there's an interesting rim protecting, rebounding, but doesn't necessarily have that switchability on defense. But there's too much value there for Toronto to let him go. So we move past a player like that, just to give you a sense of how we're going to approach it. Other guys we're not going to look at. Brook Lopez. I know he's a fan favorite. I would love to have Brook back in Brooklyn, obviously, to finish out his career. But he's going to end up back in Milwaukee because that is a veteran-heavy team around Giannis, and they're in run-it-back mode right now. A 3-year deal, something in the $55 to $60 million range for Brook Lopez is where Hollinger thinks it's going to go, and I just don't think the Nets are going to be in there. Dwight Powell, doesn't matter, don't like him, not very good. Vucevic, going to be back with the Bulls, obviously. So these are guys that we move away from simply for the fact that they're not going to be really viable options for the Brooklyn Nets. The highest level name that we can talk about, and I'm surprised to be back here again because 2.5, maybe 3 years ago, I talked about this player and wanting to potentially bring him to Brooklyn. He's had his journey, and that's Christian Wood, right? He has had an interesting career. He seems to butt heads in his different stops along the way, but there's no denying that he is a career 15 point a night game. He's a career 38% from beyond the arc, 3-point shooter. And even though the free throw numbers are not as high as you'd want them to be, he kind of represents the exact model of player that the Nets would love to have in to complement Nicolas Claxton, right? And I think this is before he goes to Houston. This is back when he's in Detroit. That's when I talked about the Nets pursuing him when he was 24, going to be 25. He goes to Houston for 2 years. He's a starter there. And it plays 41 games, 41 starts, 68 games, 67 starts in his second season with Houston. He's playing 30-plus minutes. The shooting is there. The 3-point shooting is there, averaging 5 attempts per game and knocking down 37 and 39% respectively. The only issue that I had in his time with Houston was the free throw shooting in the low 60s there, obviously. But then last season, now, and you have to contextualize this with any of these players. When they exist on a roster with a Luka, right? When they're playing with a high level, top 2, top 3 player in the league and Kyrie Irving, you're going to realize that their game gets that much easier. It becomes that much easier. But nevertheless, 67 games, 17 starts, 26 minutes a night. Again, repeated the exact same process, 37, almost 38% from beyond the arc on 4 attempts per game. He knocked down 77% from the line on 4 attempts. That number is kind of critical because if he can do that consistently, which, by the way, outside of his time in Houston, he mostly has been in the mid-70s from the line here over the course of his career. He's a career just below 70 free throw shooter, and he did a nice job of it with going back to Detroit in 24, 74% year prior, 75. So it's right where you want it to be as long as it stays in the 70s there. He's a floor spacer, right? He's good enough on defense when it comes to, he's not going to be a Nicolas Claxton switching everything and being able to defend 1 through 5. No, but he can rim protect. He can rebound, something that the Nets desperately need help in as well. And offensively, being able to put a player out on the floor of Christian Wood's level and tell him, even when Nicolas Claxton's off the floor, space the floor, create some room, knock down some shots from the outside, and he's big enough to play on the interior and get some things done around the basket. I don't mean big enough in terms of size, just consistent enough in his play on the interior. But you can also then entertain the option of playing him and Nicolas Claxton together on the court at the same time. Because now you have the ability to let Nicolas Claxton be the guy that gets out and runs in transition. Be the player that lives on the lob, off ball, in and around the basket. Be a high energy player on the offensive end, and then defensively allow him to switch out, take the most difficult assignment, allow Christian Wood to play a little bit more drop coverage, and he can be that player that steps up around the arc, picks up the players on the perimeter. There's a balance here that the Devils, boy, I've had a hard time with that lately with the amount of conversations I've had. There's a balance here that the Nets can strike with a player like this. He's not a perfect player by any stretch, right? You're gonna be excited about looking at his rebound numbers defensively, where he's grabbing you 6 boards here this past season. Again, playing reduced minutes relative to a couple of years prior in Houston. Offensively, he's not going to give you a lot on the boards. And again, that's all right, because, oh, by the way, when we go back and look at these, the evaluation on him for The Athletic and from John Hollinger, you're looking something in the $17 million range. The good news for the Nets here, we talk about relative to other targets, is the Dallas Mavericks are not pursuing bringing him back, right? That relationship is over. There's the risk around whether or not he is just a personality that is going to be hard to bring into the fold. It's going to be hard to maintain. But what does it look like, right? I just feel like for 17 million, which by the way would fall underneath the TPE, a critical piece of information here when it comes to targeting a player like this, it's certainly an option that you have to explore. If the Nets are thinking we want to stay high level competitive and we want to bring in a player that we know what he is. We're going to talk about other guys here in a minute that are options, but that I think also represent a level of uncertainty. Can they play consistently? Can they play large minutes? Can they play in the playoffs? Because there's a laundry list of guys that we will get to here coming up in a second that's the exact issue you're going to run into. So we, of course, put Christian Wood on the list of potential targets for the Brooklyn Nets. And the other guy that we'll just throw into the back end of this, because I think there's a couple of names that have always been high on the Nets fans list. I don't mean you guys are in love with them and that you think they're going to be game changers, but you believe they are a consistent player. One of them is Mason Plumlee, and he kind of falls in this category after going over to the Clippers. He obviously is a guy 33 years old. I think the age is obviously a factor. The projection here being a guy that maybe could fall underneath that MLE, looking at somewhere around 6.7. The interesting thing for me is that the Clippers need him in that role, as Hollinger explains on The Athletic. And if you're Mason Plumlee, you're probably more inclined at this stage of your career to be saying, where do I stay that gives me an opportunity to be a supporting cast member to a potential championship run, as opposed to going somewhere else? And again, for relatively the same amount of money to be whatever that's going to look like. So I don't think that he's going to fall into that list there. And then the other guy I'll throw out would be Mo Bamba. Obviously, just a name that has been mentioned consistently. LA, non-guaranteed contract that he had with them. He falls underneath that $6 million range, which is interesting. The non-guaranteed deal with the Lakers worth 10.3, and he's not worth that level of money, as Hollinger explained. So we're in this world now where Mo Bamba, being a 39+% three-point shooter and blocking almost 3 shots per 100 possessions, yeah, there's some value there. He's interesting one to me. What is that margin that we talk about between a Christian Wood at 17 million, a Mo Bamba at 6 million, right? And these are kind of the numbers that I think at some point you're going to have to work within. So I just wanted to make sure that we rounded out a couple of the familiar names before we talk about some other guys here to close out the episode, including also mentioning just who's on the roster for the Brooklyn Nets. It's a lot easier with the center position because there isn't really anybody there. We get into the Day'Ron Sharps of the Brooklyn Nets world and other free agents that I believe could have a low cost, high value for a team like the Nets. All right, rounding out the episode here, as we said at the top, no, the Brooklyn Nets will not be pursuing a trade for Karl Anthony-Towns and a massive $256 million contract, even if it meant getting off of the Ben Simmons money. The interesting thing for me, as we turn our attention back to the Brooklyn Nets, is what they do not have, right? They don't have, at this moment, any certainty around the backup center role. Day'Ron Sharpe has shown us that he can be a high energy guy. He can be a motor player that goes and attacks the glass and plays a little bit out of control in a good way, but he's an aggressive rebounder. We've dreamed on going back to when they drafted him, saying, is there a world where he can develop the outside shot? It's been something that has been theoretically said to be a part of his repertoire. We've yet to really see that come to fruition at the NBA level. And as we saw, even after the trade of Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving and bringing back in Mikal Bridges and Cameron Johnson, and Dorian Finney-Smith and Spencer Dinwiddie, right? That whole core. Yes, Day'Ron Sharpe got some run down the back end of the season, and then he did not have a role when it came to the playoffs. And that's the biggest concern here. Remember, the Nets are trying to serve the agenda of being competitive through the regular season and into the playoffs. So any move that they make here should be geared with that in mind. And it's actually what I think favors Day'Ron Sharpe and his continued development, which, by the way, we'll talk about at some point next week. There are some key dates coming up around Day'Ron Sharpe and around Cam Thomas and picking up fourth-year options on them. But this allows Day'Ron Sharpe to continue to work his game, continue to be a high-energy rebounder, and just be a player that is the back end, 13th, 14th member of the bench. I'm not going to put him all the way at the bottom. But, just a guy that gets to sit back there and continue to grow as a player. The Nets have not done a remotely good enough job of filling out their roster. They've played too much small ball. And they realize, as has been said by Sean Marks time and again this offseason, like they know they need to get bigger and they know they need to improve at that spot. So that's the short list of what they have there. I'm leaving out small ball lineups where you rotate certain players into the 5 position. When we go back out there on the market, guys that I'm not interested in, like Drew Eubanks, no thank you. Doesn't shoot threes, not that big. There's some other players. Naz Reid, by the way, gets listed like way lower on this list by a valuation standpoint. And John Hollinger does a great job of just calling that out. So this predates the Naz Reid extension by only a couple of days. I've mentioned this guy before, and that's Mo Wagner, obviously, brother of the other Wagner, down there in Orlando. And if it's me, he is a very targetable player. Now, the way that Hollinger breaks this down is expectations that he would return to Orlando and the Magic have plenty of cap space to fit his contract, given that a longer deal for above the minimum with some team flexibility in the form of declining money and or non-guaranteed years seems the most likely outcome. If it's me, I'm attacking it. If this is the scenario that's getting painted, where the years are there, it's a little bit above the minimum, his evaluation is $3.8 million, I'm willing to use the full MLE on a player like Mo Wagner for what he means to the Brooklyn Nets potentially, right? His three-point shooting needs to go in more consistently, 32%. Like, it's not great, but it's also a lot better than 0, which is what the Nets currently have in that capacity. I think he is a solid passer. He can play in the pick and roll. You can get him down and around the basket a little bit. He's not the biggest when we talk about it, and that's mostly predicated on his wingspan being a little bit undersized. But I really like him, especially when we fall into, by the way, these tiered out categories where he falls into what's considered tier 4, more than the minimum, less than the mid-level. So I'm willing to go up to the mid-level with a player like that. Then we get into the final tier, which is guaranteed minimums. And I'm just putting out names here for you that I think are worth noting, some a little bit more interesting than others. Paul Reed, Philadelphia, he's restricted. They're not letting him go anywhere. He'd be a great one to look at. Jock Landale, Phoenix, 27 years old. He would be, I think, a nice player to look at, but I think that Phoenix needs exactly that guy on the roster. They'll find a way to bring him back. Not a lot of other names of interest. I did find, before I name a veteran, let's do 2 things here. First of all, I know people have talked about Thomas Bryant. Want to make sure that I mention him here quickly because Thomas Bryant, here's the biggest problem with him. He didn't play in the playoffs. He doesn't have a playoff role. Now, does he not have a playoff role for the Denver Nuggets, but he would have a playoff role for the Brooklyn Nets? That's certainly a conversation that you could have, but that would be the biggest concern around going down the road for a player that, as is noted here, the Nuggets traded 3 second-round picks to get Bryant and then ultimately buried him going in there, right? I think that when you are a good team, when you are a great team, when you are a championship level team, a player like Thomas Bryant can maybe fall a little bit more by the wayside um, than if you're playing on a mid-level team, if you're playing on a back-end playoff team like the Brooklyn Nets. Liability defensively, not necessarily a concern when you have Nicolas Claxton. I'm interested in him. Minimum guy, which I was surprised by. Surprised that he gets put into that category. Thought that that would be a little bit higher up here on the list. Someone that maybe you'd say up to the MLE, and maybe that's what it ends up being. So I'll be fascinated to see what unfolds with him. And we talked about him before. I know he's been a name that fans really like. The other one that I'll mention here, I'm going to go very young player, and then I'm going to go veteran experienced player. There's a guy going around town that I really am interested in just is a pure prospect standpoint. And that's Jay Huff, who played for Washington this past season. When you go look, he's done a nice job developing, and he only had a very, very, and I mean very, small sample size at the NBA level. His career sample size at the NBA level is 11 games. He is however, in those very brief 11 games, been an effective 3-point shooter, really most recently this past season. Pulling up the stats in front of me, there's like this 3-game sample size. And this is, by the way, talking about a minimum guy. I'm talking about the Nets adding a player to their roster that can be someone that represents potential to be at the NBA level. The Nets don't have that guy right now. Noah Clowney brought in the door, obviously, via the draft. He's still going to be maybe a year or two away from fully getting there. It never hurts to have an extra body in the door like this. 3-game sample size where this kid played 23, 30, and 27 minutes. He knocked down 6 out of 10. Nope, 6 out of 11 from beyond the arc. This was just a guy that when you look at him, young player, 23, 24 years old, I would bring him in. Like, these are little tiny baby moves that you make. And we'll talk about here too on the back end of this episode. I'll stick around for a couple extra minutes in the live. I'm sure there's a lot of people talking about names they like, how these guys fit, etc. The last guy that I'm going to bring up, and just Jay Huff is a name that I would bring into the system. Bottom line. And the Brooklyn Nets are so devoid of talent in that room there and devoid of the skill set they need in that role that you take a shot on a player at a very low cost, maybe some high upside there for him. Last player we name then is a player that I talked about even when the Brooklyn Nets had Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving and were thinking about pursuing a championship. It's Dario Saric. Yes. Now listen, he had an injury obviously going back a couple of seasons, and then this past year he came in, didn't look like himself until about midway through the year. But how about this though? After the midseason trade with Oklahoma City, this was 20 games, 16 points per game, 65% true shooting percentage. 29 years old, understand what he is and what he is not. But if you need a player that is going to give you, and he has, consistency, he's a 36 career 3-point shooter. Shot 39% over the last 2 seasons. Well, this is the last 1 season. Didn't play in 21-22. And the years prior, he had 38, 36, and 35% from beyond the arc on almost 4, almost 3. And this past season, that number did come down a little bit. He also happens to be a career 84% free throw shooter. If we're talking about bringing in a guy that doesn't cost anything, but can represent a safety valve around getting a little floor spacing and having a body that in theory you could put on the court in the playoffs and not worry about the struggles that Nicolas Claxton has had at the free throw line, the struggles that Day'Ron Sharpe has had to be a part of that rotation. Here's another minimum player that could make a lot of sense for the Brooklyn Nets. So, with that being the case, we covered the spectrum of why big trades aren't going to happen at this position for the Nets, or maybe at any position ultimately this offseason. But Christian Wood, Mo Wagner, we talk about a Jay Huff, and we even take a look at a veteran like Dario. Those are 4 names covering the spectrum from top of the TPE coverage that we could potentially fit Christian Wood under, all the way down to low-cost moves that you can make after you clear out some of this roster. And we're going to need to have that discussion too. Who are the guys that are getting moved on from here? That being the case, we'll come back in again, like I said, backcourt episode, talking about who we have, who should stay, who should go, and who are the available players on the market. And then we'll move into the front court with both forward positions. How do we continue to get better, whether or not we're moving off of Dorian Finney-Smith, moving off of Royce O'Neal? There's still going to be names out there, and I'm pretty excited about the idea of being able to reshape the backcourt in a couple of some what feel like potentially simple moves. The Brooklyn Nets could very well reshape that backcourt while still keeping a guy like Spencer Dinwiddie in there. So be sure to be around for those episodes too. And most likely, by the way, not to throw this in at the very end, I think it's far more likely that the Nets live in the lower cost big market than they do at the high end of it, because I think it's easier to compile a cobble together a skill set that makes sense there with Nicolas Claxton currently. Whereas if you're looking in the backcourt, you maybe are more willing to do a little more work. I could be wrong. Maybe the number for Christian Wood comes out right, and that's a nice short-term rental that, by the way, at 27 years old, lines right up with this current core's timeline. That being the case, my friends, you may have noticed I'm live on YouTube for the second straight morning. And yeah, I'll probably be live again tomorrow for the third straight morning. But sometime today on Thursday, if you're listening to this episode live or you're hearing it on the podcast feed, I'm going to come back in and handle one of these other areas of need for the Brooklyn Nets in this offseason as we prepare for the free agency frenzy that should be coming. And that's why you need to be subscribed on YouTube so you don't miss the live feed. You don't miss the bonus content. That's why you need to be subscribed on the podcast feed where we get the need fulfilled. Reminder, it's 100% free. I'm doing it all for free, baby, as is Doug when he comes back. He asked for a big paycheck. They didn't give it to him. We do it all for free, man. And it costs you nothing, and it means everything to see that support. And as you know, with no Doug Norrie, there is no quote short of saying that I miss my friend. And I can't wait until he's back so we can keep talking all things Brooklyn Nets basketball. All right, my friends, let's stick around just like we did yesterday morning. Few minutes here. The pale-faced podcast host is in the building. When you're doing them solo and you're doing them live, a lot harder to follow the conversation. I think Doug mentioned this on the draft coverage. A lot harder to follow it. So I think for the most part, if I'm looking around at some of the comments that were coming in, I like, I'm just going to throw up a few that I see here. And then I see Brendan coming in with a question as well. Christian Wood, very underrated and disrespected. He will come cheaply. Yeah, I think, listen, there's self-inflicted wounds there. I think that he's a difficult personality. I think is what it comes down to. Now, that doesn't mean, by the way, being a difficult personality and being coachable or being a guy that you just stay away from completely. I don't think that he crosses that threshold. But there's clearly a reason why a player with that skill set, after a very short tenure with the Dallas Mavericks, they're saying, no, we're all good, right? Dylan Brooks, whatever went on in Memphis, right? Like, we're not even gonna put an offer on the table for you. So there are players that have a little bit of that get attached to them, which is interesting. I'm just gonna shout out Al Mack real quick. Yeah, we're going to talk about him tomorrow, the Chicago, maybe even later today. I don't know which way I want to go, hitting the forward market or hitting the backcourt. Probably the backcourt because we talked about some of the issues in the backcourt, obviously, with the Nets, but the options that are on free agency, these are the two biggest areas, right? Whether or not the forward position needs an upgrade or needs more depth. Right now in this moment, you'd say, yeah, if you walk in the door having Dorian Finney-Smith and having Royce O'Neal, you can live with that. The backcourt needs some help. So we will touch on Chicago specifically because they have a bevy of guys back there, all with big decisions to make. Brendan came in with the Locked On. What I think about Cam Thomas right now? I have high hopes for him, but I feel the only way he can truly flourish as a potential all-star is if he actually gets playing time. That is going to be in the conversation. That is going to be in that conversation around the Nets backcourt and evaluating the talent, where the team currently is, and setting a bar of expectation. So don't you worry. They call this a tease. I'm not going to tell you, but I will tell you probably later today when we come back in. Johnny coming in. Brooklyn has an $18 million trade exception, and some centers came under that, such as Kelly Olynyk, Steven Adams, and Valanciunas. Should Brooklyn use? Yeah. So again, the Christian Wood example, that is one of them. If you're talking specifically about these teams and these players, Kelly Olynyk, I'd be fine with. I actually didn't even. I know he's on. I don't know if he's. I don't know if he is a straight up. Is he a straight up? He's not a free agent right now. There's a good chance. By the way, there's other names that I didn't even get to here as this list unfolds, getting down towards the 30s, like Moses Brown, who most recently played with Brooklyn, like Blake Griffin, a veteran, like Bismack Biyombo, Alex Len, right? There are Tristan Thompson, if you want to put a name out there, and DeAndre Jordan, our old friend at 35, right? Number 35, not the 35th best. There are a lot of options here, but again, it's trying to set some reasonable bar of expectation around wanting to have a player that gives you a level of consistency. Steven Adams, I don't believe, where does he sit right now? What is the old Steven Adams contract? The beauty of doing a little bonus conversation is being able to look at this stuff kind of on the fly. He signed a 2-year contract, $25.2 million. Oh, yeah. So he's under. Yeah. So he came in at the 12.6 mark for the next got 2 seasons, 23-24 and then 24-25. So, yeah. And again, you got to remember, like a player like that, there is I'm saying limitation. Doesn't mean it's not an incredibly valuable role, but there is a limitation. So, I'm not against a player or a model of player like Steven Adams, but I don't think that that's coming onto the market or that the Nets can pursue something like that. I thought I saw. Did I see another question in here somewhere? Did Cam Thomas did that? Well, no, that's okay. What do we got here from Jean Remey? Do you think due to cap space and Simmons' contract, do you think the Nets should let the season play out before making major changes to the roster? That is something that we've touched on, right? And we've said this as the classic hedge by the Brooklyn Nets front office. And we kind of labeled it a little bit, frustrated in that regard with Sean Marks, specifically on draft night and whether or not you can move these contracts and whether or not he set too high of a bar for what he wanted for Dorian Finney-Smith and Royce O'Neal. But for me, I think that that world does exist here, right? Standing pat. But you could do nothing to this current roster, use the TPE, use the MLE, and then make your other evaluations as the season unfolds. So the Brooklyn Nets are in a position still here, whether it is a Christian Wood, whether it's a backcourt player, whatever you want to look at. They could go out and add 2 players and then allow things to unfold as the season gets underway, right? The $20 million of Joe Harris, the Patty Mills contract. What does Dorian Finney-Smith end up being in the long term? Like, right? Those are questions that they can certainly ask and evaluate. So I don't disagree on the idea of waiting it out and seeing what happens, but you can still add pieces even in that process. And in reality, this will come up around the backcourt as well. I actually think it behooves the Brooklyn Nets to do something like that when it comes to the backcourt to make sure that you're pushing someone. 12.1 just to the Kelly Olynyk number. So understanding where you're coming from there with those. What is the contract for Spencer Dinwiddie? Is a guaranteed $20 million. Played 55 games, I think was the threshold last year. Checked that box. That money is all guaranteed. We had talked about it being partially guaranteed for a time, but he crossed that threshold from Dallas and then into Brooklyn. So that's a guaranteed contract. I don't look at, and this is maybe I'm in the minority of this, I don't look at at Spencer Dinwiddie as a net negative. I know a lot of people have talked about, and I'll get into this a little bit more on that on the full backcourt episode. But I think he still has a great value to this team. Do I want his role to look different from what it was after the trade? Of course. But I don't look at Spencer Dinwiddie as being a guy that needs to be moved. Let me put it that way, right? And doesn't mean that I can't see a version of things where the backcourt looks different and he's not a part of it. But there are very clear delineations around the guys that I think should be moved on for reasons X and the guys that I think you can be okay with keeping. Some are because of financials, some are because of age, some are because of fit. So there's a lot of different versions that I think you can look at this roster and say 5 guys, 6 guys, 7. Maybe I'm like into 8 guys that I think should be a part of what you do here in a lot of different versions of it. And then you can let it unfold as it does. There was one other question that came in here. Yeah, he will be. Danny will be on the list for me when we talk about when we get into that. So yes, be sure to be here for that one. Oh, there it was. No, Dinwiddie's contract. Hey, Adam. Do you think we'll be able to get off some of these bad contracts? Yeah, I do. Simple answer. I do. I don't know when it will come, and I don't know if it's going to be the easiest process, but yes, I do. Because, I talked about this yesterday, and I'll close out here because I don't run too long on this. And I will get to, I see you down there, Clash. Welcome, good sir. Frequent flyer, every dayer, as we like to call him here on the network. I mentioned about when you look at the Nets' current cap situation, right? I think this one did a nice job of not including. It was like at 142, and then you have to, then you have the contract for Cameron Johnson coming in the door as well. So there is this very interesting kind of timeline that the Brooklyn Nets get to follow here. So I run it down. I've got, what do we see here? 150, 145. No, 157 coming out of last year, 145 coming into this season. That includes Ben Simmons, Mikal Bridges, Spencer Dinwiddie, Joe Harris, Dorian Finney-Smith, Royce O'Neal, Nicolas Claxton, Patty Mills, big 6.8. And then a couple of $2 million numbers around Cam Thomas, Day'Ron Sharpe, and Edmund Sumner, a number which will become guaranteed coming up here shortly. So 145, you throw in 20 plus million for a Cameron Johnson, and now we're pushing ourselves up to that 165 and towards 170 threshold. So you'll need to clear out a little bit here. But remember that the Nets still want to add a couple of pieces. So the best bet here is you avoid the luxury tax threshold. And if you need to eat something to get off of, say, Patty Mills, you live with that result and you get yourself a little bit lower, MLE, TPE, and you find your way to make sure that you fill this out. But in making that statement about this roster, remember, I just listed what? 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 players. The Nets have 11 players. They have roster spots to fill, and then 12 if you include Cameron Johnson, right? So they have some roster spots to fill, not a lot of money, and right now you'd say there's still work to be done to make sure that you feel like you have a balanced roster all the way down. Okay. Last one we'll get out on here will be Clash. Adam is the man. Oh, there you go. Thank you. I didn't bring it up just for that, but it never hurts. Thoughts around a power forward who can rebound and shoot threes. Al Horford, 1-year filler. I'm gonna get into them, and I think at the moment, if you said you wanted a, rebound and shoot threes, Dorian Finney-Smith doesn't do a ton of the rebounding offensively, does it some for you defensively, has a little bit of physicality. Like right now in the moment, I would just hold on that player. I will say, before we get out the door, I'll give you a little sneak preview here. I have a lovely pad that I was working my butt off on all these guys. I currently listed, and we got a couple of names. I'll put the names out that were mentioned over on Twitter. George Niang was brought by Biff Johnson, and Russell and Fro wanted to talk about Grant Williams. I had 3 other players listed at the power forward position to talk about, which is why we'll lump them in with our other forward position. And yeah, and as far as and I'm seeing, I think Al Mack is saying, like, I'm pretty sure that Horford's going to be staying with Boston. And then going into the forward spot, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 guys. 5 guys there. So we have 8 total forwards that we want to discuss, all with different skill sets, all with the ability to impact this roster and bring some depth in. So we'll talk about all those dudes as well. All right, sir. And ladies, gentlemen, everybody, whoever you are, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, thanks for spending your morning with me here on YouTube, doing the live. Again, remember, subscribe on YouTube, get the alerts on. I think we're going to shoot for later this afternoon to come back in with the backcourt conversation. Maybe I'll even try to come in the evening as well with the forward position conversation. So these are all out there before tomorrow when everything starts to explode here around free agency. And hopefully we hear the Brooklyn Nets making some moves. That being the case, absolutely appreciate each and every one of you for being here. Thanks so much. We'll see you all again next time right here, talking all things Brooklyn Nets basketball.